Hello everyone, and welcome back to Punk Theories. Like I promised, I'm back with another One Piece theory, and today, we're going back to Elbaf. Because the more we learn about this island, its history, and its people, the more I start to think that Elbaf was never just a nation of warriors. When we first heard about Elbaf, one thing was immediately clear. This is a nation of giants. A nation built around strength, warriors, honor, and battle. But as the Elbaf arc continued, Oda started showing us something very different. The younger generation of giants doesn't seem to have the same relationship with war that the older generation did. In fact, Harald spent much of his reign trying to change exactly that. And after everything we've learned about Elbaf, Harald, Rocks, Loki, and Emu, I think there may be a much deeper reason behind Elbaf's ancient warrior culture. What if the giants were never simply fighting because they loved war? What if they were preparing for something? What if Elbaf's ancient history is connected to Joy Boy and the return of the sun god? Today, I want to connect all of these pieces. And before we begin, remember, this is a fan theory. Some parts of this video are directly supported by the manga, while others are my interpretation of the clues Oda has given us. So let's start with the biggest clue of all, the legendary fruit of Elbaf. Elbaf has been protecting a legendary devil fruit for generations. This isn't just some random devil fruit. It was treated as a national treasure, and eventually, Loki was chosen to eat it. We now know that this fruit is the Ryu no Mi model Nidhöggr, a mythical zone connected to the legendary dragon Nidhöggr. But the really interesting part isn't simply Loki's devil fruit, it's the history behind it. According to Elbaf's legends, there was once a warrior god who wielded the legendary hammer Ragnir. That warrior god could become an enormous dragon and once fought the sun god. And that sun god is connected to the same mythology surrounding Nika and Joy Boy. So think about what Elbaf has been preserving. A legendary devil fruit, a legendary weapon, a legendary warrior god, and stories about a conflict with the sun god. That doesn't prove that Elbaf was Joy Boy's army, but it tells us something extremely important. Elbaf has been preserving a very old history connected to the sun god. And then we have Loki. At the beginning of the Elbaf story, Loki declared himself the sun god who would bring the world to an end after obtaining the legendary devil fruit. So Elbaf isn't simply a place where people know the name Nika. There appears to be an entire inherited mythology surrounding these figures. And this is where my theory begins. What if Elbaf was waiting? We know Joy Boy existed 800 years ago. We know his era ended in failure. We know the world government emerged at the end of the Void Century. And we know that Joy Boy's will eventually returned through Luffy. But here's the question. What if Elbaf knew this would happen? Maybe the ancient giants knew that Joy Boy would eventually return. Maybe they didn't know exactly when. Maybe they didn't even know what he would look like. But perhaps they knew that the sun god would eventually appear again. And if that's true, Elbaf's warrior culture suddenly looks very different. Maybe the giants weren't simply preserving war because they enjoyed it. Maybe their ancestors believed they needed to remain strong. Maybe they believed that one day the world would enter another great conflict. And when that day came, the giants would fight on the side of the sun god once again. Now, I want to be very clear. The manga has not confirmed this. We have not been told that Elbaf's warrior culture was created specifically to prepare for Joy Boy's return. But we do know Elbaf preserved ancient sun god traditions, protected a legendary devil fruit, and maintained an incredibly powerful warrior culture for generations. So perhaps somewhere along the way, the original reason was forgotten. The tradition remained, the warriors remained, but the purpose disappeared. And eventually, Elbaf simply became known as the Land of the Giants, a terrifying warrior nation. And that's where Harald enters the story. Harald wanted to change Elbaf. When we first see young Harald, he is almost the complete opposite of the king he eventually becomes. He is arrogant, violent, and he doesn't understand why humans fear giants. Then, Harald meets Ida, and this meeting changes his entire worldview. Ida was a giant from outside Elbaf. Harald found her being displayed as a circus attraction and believed she was being held against her will. So Harald rescued her, but in reality, he had completely misunderstood the situation. Ida had already been helped by the humans of the Bunt Kingdom. She chose to remain with them and help rebuild their community. And instead of thanking Harald for rescuing her, she slapped him. Ida forced Harald to confront something he had never really considered. The giants weren't feared simply because they were big. They were feared because of the violence some giants had inflicted on the world. Harald began to understand that strength alone wasn't what made a nation great. That moment becomes one of the biggest turning points in Harald's life. He begins traveling, building relationships, sharing knowledge, improving trade, creating schools, and most importantly, changing Elbaf's image. Harald wanted the world to stop seeing giants as monsters. He wanted Elbaf to become peaceful, and eventually, he believed the world government could help him achieve that. And this would become Harald's greatest mistake. The new Elbaf versus the old Elbaf. Look at Elbaf today. The older generation represents the legendary warriors, Dori, Bragi, Jarul, the giant warrior pirates. These are giants who grew up believing that battle was part of their identity. But Harald's reforms created something different. The younger generation grew up with education, trade, and peace. The children of Elbaf became much less interested in violence than their ancestors. Harald succeeded. He changed Elbaf. But here's the irony. Maybe the old warrior culture that Harald was trying to erase was preserving something important. Maybe those warriors weren't simply violent. Maybe they were carrying an ancient responsibility that even they no longer fully understood. And Harald, without knowing that original purpose, may have believed the warrior identity itself was the problem. So he tried to replace it. And that brings us to Rocks. Harald and Rocks were friends, and this is one of the most important relationships in the entire Elbaf flashback, because Rocks understood something Harald didn't. Harald believed the world government could help Elbaf enter the modern world. Rocks believed the opposite. He warned Harald that the world government didn't want Elbaf simply as a friend. They wanted to use the giants' strength, their warriors, their military power. And eventually, the world government made its terms very clear. If Elbaf wanted to join the world government, Harald had to kill Rocks. But Harald still refused to abandon his plan. To Harald, the world government represented a path toward peace. He believed joining the world could help Elbaf finally move beyond its violent history. To Rocks, Harald was making a terrible mistake. Eventually, Harald accepted the government's conditions, and that destroyed their friendship. Think about how tragic that is. Harald wasn't betraying Elbaf because he hated his people. He believed he was saving Elbaf. He believed peace was the answer, and because of that belief, he sacrificed his friendship with Rocks. Then came God Valley. Rocks went there for his own reasons, including his family. Harald was not there to stand beside him. And after everything that happened at God Valley, Harald continued down the path he had chosen. He believed that if he completely committed himself to peace, perhaps he could finally erase the violent history of the giants. But the world government had other plans. Years later, the world government's manipulation of Harald went even further. Harald was brought into the system as a devoted blade and eventually received a covenant from Emu. And that changed everything. The man who wanted peace for Elbaf was now being turned into a weapon against Elbaf. Emu wanted the giants as soldiers, the exact thing Rocks had warned Harald about. Harald eventually understood that the world government's plan had never truly been about helping Elbaf. They wanted its warriors. They wanted its strength. And Harald finally understood. Rocks was right. He had trusted the wrong side. He had sacrificed his friendship. He had spent decades trying to bring Elbaf closer to the world, only to discover that the world government wanted to control his people. But by then, it was too late. The Covenant had given Harald immense power and an immortal body, but at the cost of obedience. Harald could feel himself losing control, and eventually, he realized that his body was beginning to obey Emu, even when his own mind resisted. So Harald did something incredible. He asked his own soldiers to restrain him. Then he ordered them to call Loki and Jarul. Harald knew that if Emu completely took control of him, Elbaf would be doomed. And that's when Loki and Jarul arrived. Harald finally told Loki the truth. He had been deceived. The world government had used him. And now, there was only one way to save Elbaf. Harald told Loki about Elbaf's legendary Devil Fruit. Then he asked his son to attack him. Not because Harald hated Loki, not because Loki wanted the throne, but because Harald knew that if Emu completely took control of him, Elbaf would be doomed. And there is something even more tragic. Harald didn't simply ask Loki to attack him. He believed Loki was ready to lead Elbaf. He was willing to let history remember him as a failure if it meant Elbaf could survive. Loki eventually ate the legendary fruit after Ragnir chose him, and with the power of Nidhöggr, together with Ragnir's power, Loki was able to bring his father's life to an end. But the truth was not what the people of Elbaf believed. Loki wasn't simply a son murdering his father for power. He was carrying out Harald's final wish. And then Loki made another sacrifice. He allowed the world to believe that he was the father slayer, the son who murdered his own king. He carried that reputation for 14 years, because sometimes protecting someone's legacy means allowing yourself to be hated, until Jarul finally revealed the truth to all of Elbaf. Loki had been innocent of the crime everyone believed he committed, and Harald's true final wish was for Elbaf's future. And this brings us back to Joy Boy. Now let's put everything together. Elbaf has ancient sun god traditions. Elbaf protected a legendary devil fruit. That fruit is connected to the legend of a warrior god who could become an enormous dragon and fought the sun god. Loki, after obtaining that power, had already once declared himself the sun god who would bring the world to an end. Elbaf has preserved its warrior identity for generations. Harald tried to replace that warrior identity with peace. He opened Elbaf to the outside world. He trusted the world government. And that trust nearly destroyed everything he had built. Meanwhile, the world government has repeatedly tried to control the giants. And now, in the present day, Emu is directly intervening in Elbaf. So maybe the reason Elbaf's ancient history matters so much isn't simply because giants are powerful. Maybe Elbaf has been connected to the struggle against the world government for far longer than we realize. Maybe the giants were once waiting for the return of the sun god. Maybe the purpose of their warrior culture was forgotten. Maybe Harald accidentally destroyed part of that ancient tradition, while believing he was saving Elbaf. And maybe Loki is now standing in the middle of the conflict that his ancestors were preparing for. Because this time, the sun god has actually appeared. And his name is Luffy. But there's one more thing. If you want to go deeper into this idea, I actually have a small theory series on the channel that connects with this. I've divided it into 3 parts: the forgotten origin, the second betrayal, and the final act. Those videos explore some of the ideas behind the ancient connection between the giants, Joy Boy, and the events we're seeing now. And if you're interested in this theory, I definitely recommend checking those 3 videos out because they go deeper into the pieces I couldn't fully cover here. Also, I have to give you a warning. The first video was the first video I ever made on this channel, so yeah. The images are really bad, seriously. Don't judge the channel based on that one. The theory is what matters. And hopefully, as we continue exploring Elbaf, Joy Boy, and the Final Saga, we'll find out whether this was just another fan theory, or whether Oda has been hiding the true purpose of Elbaf's warriors in plain sight all along. What do you think? Was Elbaf's warrior culture simply part of their nature, or were the giants preparing for the return of the sun god? Let me know what you think. And if you enjoyed the theory, subscribe to Punk Theories for more One Piece theories. I'll see you in the next one.